The clock above the kitchen sink was at 10:17 a.m. when Amanda, sighing, sat down on her chair, surrounded by an unwashed arsenal of dishes. A pot of egg yolks, empty plates from the children's breakfast, a cup of James's coffee left over, a dried-up crust of jam on the table. She felt her anger reignite her, and every morning, the same thing. Waking the kids, making breakfast, driving them to school, then rushing home to catch her husband running and sneaking a kiss on the cheek. Her life gradually turned into a continuous cycle of activities, leaving no time for anything more exciting. James was still the reliable, responsible man she had once chosen, but a void had settled in their relationship. Romance gave way to a quiet but a little cold routine, in which she felt lonely, quiet, cold. She took the envelope from the windowsill and read again the carefully typed text. Dear Amanda, we are happy to invite you to the graduation meeting. Meeting place, the Grand Oaks Restaurant, Saturday, 6 p.m. We hope to see you. The letters floated before her eyes, as if they were not on the invitation card, but in her head, growing with each moment into a vivid, captivating thought. Rumor has it that Dan Wright, the very Dan who was once her first love, will be present at the meeting. The thought of this set Amanda's heart on fire. She felt a long-forgotten energy return, as if the mere thought of Dan made her feel younger. The decision came naturally. She breathed and squeezed her lips, driving away the vague guilt inside. She's not going to miss this meeting, and no one can stop her, and the fog of Saturday night was just as it was when she ran out of the house and left James a message on the kitchen table. I'm having a graduation meeting. I'll be back late. I love you. She knew that loving was more of a habit than an expression of feelings, but it wasn't to the point of digging herself up. And as she walked to the restaurant, her thoughts sank into memories, and images of her old school days surfaced one after another, like the shots of an old movie. Sun-drenched sports fields, noisy corridors, the smell of cheap perfume, the laughter of friends. And Dan is a skinny guy in a leather jacket with a perpetual smile on his face, a little cynical and yet attractive, and she felt like she was the other guy next to him, more daring, more alive, more adventurous. She wanted stability, comfort, and quiet happiness. But Dan was burning with a desire to explore the world, to move forward, to succeed, and they ended up going their separate ways. And those thoughts came back to her now that her life had taken a completely predictable, uniform course, and she knew that she had made the choice that she thought was the right one in her senior year. But now, more and more, she was wondering, what if she had taken a chance? What if she had stayed with Dan? Amanda didn't notice when she walked into the restaurant. She stopped before she walked in, feeling a sudden sense of insecurity. Was it worth all the stress she'd experienced in the last few days? Looking back at her past, would Dan be completely different? She was standing at the door, feeling a sort of alarm coming down her throat, and she took a deep breath and pushed the door, and there was music playing inside, the music they had danced to at the prom, and there were wine glasses on the tables, and there was a laughing noise in the middle of the room, pointing to old photographs. Amanda glanced at the crowd and caught herself desperately looking for Dan in the crowd, as if his very presence could instantly take her back in time. And then he appeared, and Dan was standing a little bit away with a glass of wine, and he was talking to some woman who looked like she was about 35 years old, and it was hard to believe that she was looking at the same guy, but she recognized him. Dan noticed her look and smiled, slightly crooked as before. Amanda felt the inside of her being compressed. Dan turned to her and said something and stepped up to her. She felt 10 years younger, but at the same time she was overcome with an unusual excitement. Amanda, was that you? Dan, she tried to hold her smile, but it was impossible. They hugged, and she noticed that his hands weren't as young and skinny as before, but they felt as secure. How long since we've seen each other? He said, with a slightly sad smile. And here we are again. Yes, time flies. It's weird to be back in this town. She looked at him with interest, and you've changed, but not so much. Dan laughed, but something else appeared in his eyes, deeper, like he was trying to understand what kind of person she had become. Now all that's left of her version is memories, almost unfamiliar ones, with her standing next to each other, listening to each other, and talking in a low voice about their school years, about friends they've almost forgotten, about friends they've long since left. And at some point, their conversation is interrupted by the voice of one of the organizers, who invites everyone to a table to make a toast. Amanda, caught in a sudden frustration, noticed Dan's delay and looked at her again as if he wanted to say something important. At dinner, Dan was next to her. They were sitting at the same table, and every joke they made, every look they gave her, it was a strange feeling. She remembered all the conversations they had once had, all the seriousness of dreaming about the future, even though they knew they were unlikely to stay together, and it seemed like they were going back to the same thing, as if those words could change something again. And she felt something wake up inside her, and her heart started beating faster again. And at the end of the night, he invited her out for a breath of fresh air. It was cool outside, the wind was playing with her hair, and Dan, with his head down, was looking at her as if he had been waiting all this time for the moment to say something important. "Have you ever wondered, Amanda," he began, "what your life would have been like if we had stayed together?" Amanda was standing in the dark parking lot next to the restaurant and looking at Dan. The question hung in the air, and it took her breath away. He held her hand. His fingers were cooling her skin. But from that intimacy, Amanda suddenly felt alive, as if everything that had been between them had returned for a second. "Did you think?" She looked down, smiling awkwardly. "I guess. Sometimes. And sometimes, you ask yourself these questions," and Dan looked at her, and his eyes were so understanding that Amanda couldn't help but say, "I think I've become a function. Every day is the same thing: breakfast, school, work, cleaning, dinner. I think I'm losing myself. I'm losing the joy of life." "I can't believe you feel that way," Dan said, leaning closer, and his voice sounded softer but more confident. And then she felt something inside her, something that had been forgotten for a long time, come alive. It was some strange idealism. "It's all too naive. We live as we can," she waved, trying not to sink back into regret. But something in Dan's eyes told her that he didn't agree. "Are you living the way you want to live, or the way it happened?" he asked with a slight smile, but there was a persistent seriousness in her voice. Her ability to pull out what she was hiding from herself was always fascinating. At school, he could see her authenticity, not hiding behind conventions and cautious phrases. They looked at each other in silence, and finally Amanda couldn't stand it. "I don't know, Dan. Maybe I once chose this path because it seemed right." Her voice trembled. "But today I'm not even sure that it was my choice." The words slipped from her lips, and she suddenly realized that she was saying something she would never have dared to say out loud. She hadn't discussed it with anyone in all these years, not even with James. Especially with James, and Dan was holding her hand, and she let herself forget for a moment about time, about home, about all the decisions that had led her to this life, and he drew her closer, and her heart beat faster, and being close to him was like something familiar and warm, like the smell of a place you love, and it was like a breath of fresh air. They were standing so close that Amanda could smell his perfume, light with a hint of tobacco that she used to love so much. "Done? Quiet," he whispered, putting his hand on her shoulder. He was so close that she could feel him holding his breath. "You don't have to say anything." She knew that she was drawn to him not just as an old love, but as a person with whom she associated her dreams of freedom and opportunity. And with Dan, everything seemed easier, real and warm. And he smiled, and his eyes flashed the same expression that they had years ago when they were carefree schoolboys, and they walked to the nearest park bench. She felt their hands touch each other slightly, and she didn't notice how she carefully wrapped her fingers around him. "Sometimes I think back to the day we decided to break up, and I realize I made a mistake." And it was like those words woke her up from a long sleep, and Amanda was sitting there, frozen, unable to answer right away, and it was like a long-forgotten wound had opened up inside her that had been healing all this time. Dan nodded, looking at her carefully, as if trying to see in her eyes the answer he wasn't afraid to say. And if I could turn back the clock. He didn't, but the words hung in the air, like something unspoken, painful and sweet at the same time. She felt that she was being overwhelmed by the familiar feeling of dangerous excitement, that it was here and now, in front of her, and she could touch her past, feel herself as she was, and she suddenly realized that her thoughts were overwhelming reality, and she saw a life that she could live. A life where there was no endless routine, where there was no accumulated discontent. A life where it's just her and Dan, spontaneity and laughter. And it seems like everything she's ever dreamed of, but something inside her is suddenly broken, and her children's faces are flashing back, and James's smile, and his way of raising his eyebrows when he thinks. She felt these images start to sober her up like a cold breeze on a hot day. Dan, noticing her confusion, let go of her hand and stood up, looking down at the ground for a moment. "Sorry, Amanda," he muttered, breathing. "I think I was in a hurry." She stood up and stood next to me, feeling awkward. She was suddenly hurt by the realization that their memories were something they could not return to. "No, it was my fault," she said a little more quietly, trying to smooth things over. I need to go back." On the way back, Amanda thought that these words had cast a shadow over her, bringing her back to reality. She returned home, where everything was already asleep. As she climbed the stairs, she glanced at the children's bedroom and felt something like relief. Life, which seemed so monotonous to her, suddenly appeared in a different light. Everything that happened with Dan and James and her children was something that belonged to her and something that she wouldn't want to change. The meeting itself turned out to be more than just a graduation meeting. It became something that helped her get back on her feet. The next morning, as soon as Amanda woke up, she realized that her thoughts were returning to the previous evening. In the kitchen, while preparing breakfast, she was struggling to concentrate on her usual tasks. The bread was burning in the toaster, and the coffee was stronger than usual. Everything reminded her of the untold things about Dan. The look on his face, the closeness of his hands, the smell of his perfume. All of it seemed to be stuck in her mind, and she wasn't going to leave. She was standing in the middle of the kitchen, trying to put her thoughts together. But the more time passed, the more clearly she realized that the meeting yesterday had opened up something in her that she had been trying to forget. She got a text on the phone, and she noticed her heart beating a little faster. It was Dan. "Just talk like old friends. Just talk." She was hurt by those words. After yesterday, she felt that they could not be simple anymore. But something was still pushing her to agree. Maybe she needed to get her head straight. She answered, "Hi, Dan." "Yes, it would be nice to meet you." She was looking at the screen of her phone, as if waiting for him to tell her if she was doing the right thing. A couple of hours later, they were sitting at a little coffee table in the corner, almost empty at this time of day. He was waiting for her by the window, and, seeing her, his face lit up with a slight smile. She noticed that he was wearing a gray sweater that looked even better than his jacket yesterday. He seemed completely relaxed and happy to see her. "I'm glad you wrote." Amanda started, sitting across the table. "I just wanted to calmly discuss everything. How are you?" Dan smiled slightly, studying her with his eyes, as if trying to figure out what words to choose. "I think I said too much yesterday." Finally, he said, "I probably shouldn't have been so honest with you knowing that you're not alone." Amanda felt her throat tightening. He was saying something obvious but painful, like the reality she'd been trying to forget was coming back. "You've been gone a long time, but this meeting, it stirred something in me." He was silent, just listening to her, as if he was preparing to accept any truth she had. "I love my family, my children, but sometimes I catch myself thinking that somewhere I've gone wrong. And yesterday, I felt like I'd gone back in time, where everything was possible. Do you know that?" He nodded. and his eyes were filled with understanding. He reached out and covered her hand, and the gesture was so simple and honest that she couldn't take it off. They sat in silence, as if time had stopped, and none of them wanted to break the silence. And I don't want to mess up their life, but sometimes I think that mess is something that we both fear because it makes us see the truth. And she was silent, afraid to say something that would ruin that moment. And she was having a hard time figuring out where the truth ends and her longing for the untimely begins. And then he was sitting across from her again, and their hands were touching, and she wanted to forget about everything that happened after school, all the compromises, the quiet and secure life that she had chosen. And suddenly she realized that she wanted to take a chance to go after that feeling, whatever it was. But I think it's not a coincidence, because he slowly raised her hand and touched her fingers with his lips, almost imperceptibly, and that movement made her heart beat even harder. She knew that she had only a little time left, and she would allow herself to do something she had long dreamed of doing, but what she thought was impossible. They sat in the cafe for a while longer, talking about everything and nothing, sharing memories that seemed to take her back years. When it was time to say goodbye, they went out quietly, and there was an unbearable silence in the air. I don't know what's going to happen next, but if you ever want to just run away, you know where to find me. Her heart was racing, but she just nodded, feeling that this conversation would stay with her, like something secret and exciting at the same time. When she got home, James was sitting in the kitchen staring at the laptop screen. He looked up and smiled briefly. "How was your day? Are you all right?" he asked in a casual tone, not taking his eyes off the screen. "Yes," she said quietly, hiding her eyes. She met a friend, had a cup of coffee. He went back to her laptop, and she felt something like pity. Here is the man she had built a life with, the father of her children. They hadn't been in love for years, but James remained her most trusted friend. She wanted to share what was going on in her head with him, but fear of breaking the fragile harmony they had created held her back. Amanda took a shower, feeling the warmth of the water washing away the traces of her secret emotions and thoughts. She couldn't shake the thought that her life had somehow lost its direction, and now her only choice was to take the risk or stay in her familiar safe haven. And as she fell asleep, she realized that she had never thought about her life so seriously before. She was overwhelmed by the realization that she was stuck between the past, full of unexplored possibilities, and the present, reliable but dim. The next day, she saw that Dan had written to her again, a simple message. "I'm thinking of you. If you want to talk, I'm here." She tried to focus on her daily activities, but every reminder of Dan, every accidental memory, every little detail, burned her like a hot corner. Dan was still on her mind, and now that she had this simple but dangerous message between them, she could not ignore the inner voice that called her to him. She promised herself that she would just talk to Dan, figure out how she felt, and finally find answers, and maybe this meeting would help her to close the story once and for all and move on. She wrote a short message to Dan. "I can see you tonight." His response followed almost immediately. "I'll wait by the lake." Amanda felt her heart beat with excitement and a slight fear, because the lake he had invited her to was a place where they often spent their school years, secret, cozy, hidden behind the trees, away from the city streets, where they came to be alone, away from the rest of the world. It now seemed to her a symbol of what they had left behind, and what she had perhaps tried in vain to forget. Dan was already waiting for her, leaning against the hood of his car and looking into the dark patch of water. She got out of the car, trying to keep calm, but his presence, even here under the night sky, in complete silence, aroused in her the same insecurity and weakness as on the first night they met. "Hello," he said, looking at her with a smile full of something warm and lively. "I didn't know you were coming, but I'm so glad you're here." She nodded, thinking but couldn't answer right away. She felt like all they could say to each other was in their looks and their long silence. "Dan," she finally started, "I came because I needed to talk. With you, but maybe more with myself. He looked at her seriously and nodded. I made the only right decision, and we're both grown up, and we have our own lives, but I can't help but think about what might have been if things had been different. You were the one who helped me figure out what I really wanted. His words hung in the air like a quiet whisper that exposed all her doubts. She felt this simple truth pierce through all her defensive barriers. The words she was afraid to say still came out. Dan, I feel locked in my life. I love my children. I respect my husband, but I can't shake the feeling that I should have chosen a different path. His eyes were glowing with compassion and understanding, and he came closer and took her hand. His voice sounded so soft that it seemed like it wasn't words, but just a thought he had accidentally uttered, and she felt something explode inside her, as if her whole world had become a mirage, like their reflections in a lake, and she could no longer tell what was real. Risk, doubt, the longing for freedom. Everything was mixed up, turning into pain and a desperate need to make a decision. Dan, she whispered, feeling she couldn't resist these feelings that were like raging inside her. I don't know what to do. I can't betray my family, but I can't go on living with the feeling that something important is missing. You don't have to make a decision now, he said, not letting go of her hand. Just give yourself the opportunity to make a choice that is truly yours. Their eyes met, and in that look was everything. Pain and despair and love that never died. She realized that she could no longer resist her feelings. She was drawn to him, as if in a silent plea for him to help her understand herself. He hugged her, and their lips merged into a kiss that was so long awaited that she was dizzy. That kiss seemed to open all the doors she'd been closing for years. But as soon as her hands touched his shoulders, she fell asleep. She stepped aside as if from a dream, and met his confused gaze. Done? She took a step back, covering her mouth with her hand. Sorry, but I can't. I can't just give up. I can't hurt the people I love like that. And her eyes are filled with tears which she tried to hold back, but they were coming out of her, because she knew that she had made a choice at that moment. No matter how much she was drawn to Dan, no matter how much she wanted to go back in time, she needed to stay where she was needed. Amanda. He started trying to understand her, but she had already backed away from the car. Sorry, Dan, she whispered, without looking him in the eye. But I have to go back. My place is there, next to them. She got into the car, and without waiting for him to answer, she turned the engine on and left. Everything inside her was shattered, but for the first time in a long time, she felt like she had made a decision. She knew she wasn't going to be bothered by what might have been. Yes, her life wasn't perfect, but it was real. It was her life, and it was her choice. When she got home, she went into the bedroom where James was sleeping. She sat on the edge of the bed and gently took his hand, feeling the warmth of his skin seeping into her, letting her know that she was home. The Rayall house was here. The next morning when James woke up, Amanda looked at him with a new warmth. You know we deserve something more? I want us to be real. I want us to be happy together again. Would you like to try? He smiled, a little confused, but still nodded, and her heart was filled with a feeling of warmth and relief. It was a few days before the memories of Dan stopped dragging her back. But Amanda knew she had made the right choice. She had chosen her family. She had chosen her life, with all its imperfections and difficulties. And it was a few weeks later, and life was back to normal, but for Amanda, it was not the same. She felt that her life would never be the same again, because something had appeared in her that she had long suppressed. The desire to live sincerely, without closing herself off from her own emotions and feelings. One day, returning home after a long day, she stopped at the bedroom door where James was writing something on his laptop, looking tired. He looked up at her, and he smiled briefly, as if touching the ground, before looking down at the screen again. She realized it was time to speak frankly for the first time in years. She closed the door quietly behind her, and James raised his head, a little surprised at her sudden seriousness. James, she began, sat down opposite him on the bed. We need to talk. Well, he said, putting his laptop away. There was a sense of fear and surprise in his eyes, as if he was sensing something important, but not knowing what to prepare for. She was silent for a moment, picking words. James looked down and thought. He was always a good listener, but he was hard to find being honest. He wasn't used to discussing feelings, he wasn't used to talking about what was going on inside, and she knew that. But I thought it was normal that everyone was like this. Work, kids, I just didn't want to interrupt you. She sighed, feeling her heart beating. They never discussed these things, and that was their mistake. I want us to be a family again. I want you to be not just my husband, but a close friend again. He listened to her carefully, and then slowly he reached out and squeezed her fingers. His eyes softened. Amanda, he said softly, forgive me for being so busy. I was so absorbed in my work that I didn't notice you drifting away. I want to make it right, but I don't know where to start. Let's try to start by just being honest with each other. You don't have to be strong all the time. You can say what you feel. I want to hear it, James, she said, covering his hand. He nodded, and his face lit up, as if he had found the answer in her words that he had been looking for so long. She saw a glimmer of hope in his eyes that she hadn't seen in a long time, and it was at that moment that she realized that by staying with James, she had not really given up on her dream of freedom, but had regained it, but in a different form. She was now free to pursue her chosen path honestly, without hiding from her feelings or neglecting those around her. Amanda began to make small changes in their lives. She found a hobby she had long dreamed of. She enrolled in drawing classes. She had been drawn to art since school, but she suppressed this passion by choosing a more practical path. Now she decided to return to what had once been her joy. James, too, began to spend more time with his family. He tried to take the children out for walks. He organized family evenings with Amanda. Their home regained a warmth and intimacy that had been missing for so long. Gradually, in small steps, their family became what they had dreamed of. They had to go through a rough road to realize their mistakes, to start building not just a life together, but a real, honest relationship. And even though Amanda still thought about Dan sometimes, those memories didn't hurt her anymore. She accepted them as an important part of her life that helped her get back to herself.